Hello. I am continuing my video blog. I've been doing them about every 2 months or 3 months or so, trying different formats and to make them flow. Um, this one I wrote a couple of years ago on the same day, Passover. Today is actually Good Friday, so Passover was last night, but it's the celebration of Passover that motivated me to write this particular blog, and I thought it'd be interesting to reminisce. Passing over. I didn't grow up Jewish, and I actually didn't even meet Jewish people until I was an adult. So the idea that Jesus was Jewish, it actually never resonated with me on any level. Because I didn't have any frame of reference other than my Christian experience of Judaism on how to relate to Jesus and the entire experience of his people as Jews over all the centuries. The millennia go from the Old Testament even up until almost current history. I had read, of course, and been told of the absolute horrific suffering of Jewish people at the hands of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Really, that's the most I'd ever known of them. But, putting that in context with the Christian understanding of Jews really doesn't come up until Lent. The celebration of Lent starts after Mardi Gras for 40 days and 40 nights. Christians would reference Passover. Because of the Last Supper, Jesus and his friends were celebrating Passover on the night he was betrayed, the day before he died. And this was this long traditional feast of his people, the Jews. But I really couldn't relate. The entire Exodus story, it's kind of thrilling. The murder, intrigue, stabs turning into snakes. But it was never very spiritual for me. Finally, it wasn't until I was in college I had the opportunity to study Judaism quite in depth. And, I learned from the Torah, I read the Old Testament, and we did these things from the point of view of the Jewish people for whom it was written, not necessarily just from the context of Christians studying externally, but trying to understand really from the personal experience of the Jews themselves. We study word by word the ancient texts, and so when Jewish festivals would come, and the Jewish holidays that were celebrated would come around, we as a group of theological and philosophical students, we would honor those feasts and celebrations as much as we were able in the same fashion that our Jewish brothers and sisters were doing. But if I think about it, really my study of theological and biblical history, my biblical exegesis, it was on many levels my own exodus, the beginning of my fleeing from being faithful to faithless. Almost from the very first class I had in biblical study, I was awakened to the rather contradictory nature and complete lack of logic in the Bible. Up until this point in my life, I'd certainly read the Bible or parts of the Bible and been given snippets of the Bible. Catholics read a couple of chapters on Sundays, Old Testament, New Testament, Gospels. And they're always given to us in piecemeal. But on my first Old Testament class, I learned that the very first book of Genesis, in its very first 2 chapters, has not just one, but 2 creation stories that aren't the same, by the way. And I realized that at that moment, any literal interpretation of biblical texts, it really would be possible. Still, even after what was a huge revelation for myself, most theological studies further down the course of my education would insist that, really, yes, some parts of the Bible, they're not meant to be literal. Some parts of the Bible are metaphorical or allegorical. But some parts of the Bible, for example, the New Testament, that contains texts that are literally true. For example, one that the Catholic Church holds very near and dear to itself is that when Jesus takes the unleavened bread at the Last Supper, and he says, "Take this and eat it. This is my body." It's Matthew chapter 26, verse 26. Upon reading this and thinking about it in context, my mind kind of fell back onto its heels. And the thought arose, this is hypocritical. Why really, would Christian revelations of the New Testament have more sway, more truth with a small t and truth with a big T than the Old Testament? Literal. Then upon further consideration, why would the Judeo-Christian understanding of God really have more sway than a Hindu or an Islamic or a Shintoist or any other faith system's understanding of God or divinity? And it really became apparent to me that the entire process of determining divinity, it seemed rather ethnocentric and egotistical. My faith crisis did not lessen with time or with further study. In fact, the more I learned about the theological application of biblical and religious tradition, in my own experience as a Catholic, in my own experience as a Christian, I realized the absolute self-centered nature of faith itself, and that the divine and the study of the divine, the tradition of the divine, was mankind's own attempt to understand a universe that is not comprehensible by the human brain. The enormity of the size and scope of the universe, it makes absolute sense why we, a self-aware species, would attempt to sum the limitless depths of space and time into the unseen, unknown, but all-powerful divinities that we can define. Faith and tradition helps us define that which is not definable. Life, death, and infinity. Yet what makes no sense, really, is that we as a species have expanded our ability to see beyond the confines of our own solar system. So these ancient traditions of faith were evolved with the human experience that didn't allow us to know that when you looked into the night sky, it went on forever. Early man didn't know that. Couldn't. I think there's a great expression, you don't know what you don't know. So it makes sense then that because of our limits, I suppose, we have clung all these centuries to the ancient and fantastical notions of divinity. We allow ourselves to hold on really to two creation stories. One, as a human species, is that some God was involved in the creation of the universe. And then the second creation story is that the universe simply has always existed and shall always be. And that some force of nature that we call the Big Bang got it all moving. And we have since evolved. So there's those two elements of story. One is that divine created the universe, and the other is that it simply just is. Looking back, I remember my very first Seder meal, and I had it at Conception Seminary College. And the preparation for this feast was amazing, and the excitement built around it was impressive. You know, during Lent, it's a very common Christian practice to fast. You know, you limit yourself to give up something or some things. This meal, this marvelous feast, celebrating the freedom of God's chosen people, it would be a chance for us to let our hair down in the final moments before we relive those last moments of Christ's life and death, and finally his resurrection. This was a special time because the seminarians were joined by the entirety of the monastic community, a rare and almost always delightful treat. In my college, we always took our meals Monday through Thursday in a formal fashion. Meals were served with waiters. The waiters were the other students serving upon one another. We had linen tablecloths, cloth napkins, proper distribution of courses set out. You know, you have your bread, your salad, then they take it away, and you get your dinner, they take that away, and then you get your dessert. Very fancy. The Seder wasn't really any different, and the feast, it was laid out in the same great fashion. The difference, though, was the type of food. You know, sticking to the traditional Jewish foods of unleavened bread, bitter herbs, charoset, leafy vegetables dipped in salt water, lamb, hard-boiled eggs, and 4 glasses of wine. The abbot, who at this time, this was my first year of celebrating this, was Abbot James Jones, and he would allow the youngest seminarian to ask a question: why is this night different from all other nights? This created a magical night, and it was fun. And for a minute, I loved the faith that I was participating in. Thinking now of these memories, the grandness of the traditions, the warm feelings and sense of belongings, I really understand the attraction to this life and not wanting to let it go, to be quite honest with you. I understand our ability to set the doubts of God and the doubts that faith may arise away and to allow oneself to be wrapped in tradition. The stories, the meals, the companionship, the sense of belonging, the sense of believing that we are the most important things in the universe, it's really very compelling. Growing up as a child, I always wanted to be special, to be different. I wanted to be recognized. And the faith traditions that I was given, they allowed me to be with my brethren, those seminarians. We were special and we were recognized, at least in that small community. And ultimately, I think that faith, the belief in God, though, it's egotistical, certainly for me. It is an indulgent practice that helps us justify our experiences of fear and loneliness. It is a practice that makes us feel rather huge in a universe that is without limit. We who are limited become limitless because of our faith. The microscopic reality is that we represent, in our own minds, value that is more grand. And faith allows us to indulge these fantasies. And if we indulge them, indulge believing that our gods care enough to personally involve themselves in our lives, we are really special. It's ironic. If you're on the wrong side of that God's attention, let's just say, for instance, the Egyptian firstborns, during the Exodus event, your days are limited. The divinity and the divinity's people who may be in opposition to you, they're going to destroy you. The concept of a merciful, loving creator is no longer relevant if you do not bend to his will. And even those who are innocent, let's say the babies, the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, will face the wrath of a divine being who is anything but merciful. Now, Christians can justify this because they say that sin is like a contagion. That my sins will cause suffering in my children. And so, because of the sins of the fathers, the sons must pay. I'm opposed to slavery, 100%. I'm opposed to oppression. I really don't like murder. I'm opposed to people taking revenge to destroy those who were wronged, or to destroy, rather, the ones who enacted the wrongful behaviors on others. In reading the story of the divine reaction of God to Pharaoh's stubbornness to release the Jews from slavery back to Moses and to Aaron, I'm really reading about a greedy leader, the Pharaoh, who wouldn't release his people. But what about the rest of the sons of Egypt? They weren't the oppressors. And the punishment that was meted out against them smacks very soundly, to me, of humanity's vanity and its need to be recognized. So God's action against the Pharaoh and all of the sons of Egypt, in the biblical sense, kind of sounds like a man who's just being pissy and taking out quite a lot of revenge, right? Because, the biblical tale of the death of the firstborn sons of Egypt reads like the revenge tale that would probably be better suited for network television than for the basis of a grand faith trying to communicate just how much God loves his people. So much so, he'll murder everyone else. In reading the story of Exodus, God sent his angel of death against the firstborn sons of Egypt so as to set his people free. It struck me all those years ago as a very hateful tale. Following my first Seder meal, that night I went to the chapel, and I was in prayer. And in thinking about the revengeful and murderous act of this alleged divinity, I realized I could not, and I would not, believe. These tales of unleavened bread becoming the body of Christ, and not figuratively but literally, this story of the sons of Egypt being murdered in their sleep by a divinity, all smacked again of mankind's ego to me. And sometimes It allows us to fantasize about the destruction of those who don't agree with us, who don't believe like us, they don't love like us. These faiths that celebrate the murder of those who may not be like us, who even oppress us, are not faiths to which I can subscribe. I realize that my own goodness is not the result of a passion from a divinity. It genuinely is the result of my own humanity. So on some level, my first celebration of Passover was my last. This intoxicating story of revenge, divine intervention, seems so convenient, so contrived, and very compelling. This faith is too easy to deny my own humanity so as to indulge my ego. I sat in that chapel all those years ago and pondered that question: what makes this night more special than any other night? And the answer came to me: absolutely nothing. Exodus chapter 11, verse 5. And all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sits upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant who is behind the mill, and the firstborn of all the beasts. Chapter 11, verse 29. Then at midnight, the Lord slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, as well as the firstborn of all of the animals. And you had to ask yourself, did the angel of death, the angel of the Lord, did she weep? And I've always just loved this painting. It's just so interesting to see that this theological context, this divine being sent this angel who wept at the actions that she took at the command of her God. And we have to ask ourselves, is our faith a result of our own ego? Our own desire to understand and know that which is not comprehensible by a finite being? And I'm guessing, yeah, it probably is. Anyways, just my opinion, observations, my own journey of faith and journey out of faith. If you are celebrating Passover and Easter, if you are celebrating it in the Christian tradition or a Jewish tradition, I do wish you the best. I wish you peace and joy and happiness and all those wonderful things that come into these stories. I just hope that these wonderful things come into these stories and are enacted upon as a result of your own desire to be closer to your fellow humans, and not a desire to be free from your own fear and doubt, not as a result of your ego. Anyways, have a good night. I will post more of these as I can. Cheers.